I already did multiple videos about my political philosophy of anarchist communism, heavily influenced by the works of Murai Bookchin and Enrico Malatesta. And I also made a video about my overall philosophy, metaphilosophy, which is Wittgensteinian pragmatism, which is a combination of pragmatism, Wittgenstein's philosophy, especially his uncertainty, and his final days in his life is developing this new philosophy, and postmodernism and post-structuralism. So I want to talk about the philosophical theology and why, it's my position that as atheism, and why God, regardless which version we're talking about, regardless which definition we're talking about, it is impossible. It cannot exist. By simple, nobody can agree the definition of a God. So how you gonna approve something if you don't even agree what the word even means? It's like a scientist trying and nobody agrees what gravity is. So how you gonna falsify the theory of gravity if you don't know the definition? You can't even agree how to define it. That is a major problem of theology. And also, even if we do find a coherent theology, like if we find all the cultures in the world from all different time periods, from as far back as the Paleolithic, hunter-gatherer societies like the San people, all the way to postmodern theologians like Mark Taylor in his work God Without Being, for example. The what is the common description of a god or deity, depending how you want to use the word? From primitive, hunter-gatherer societies, early animist way of thinking, to postmodern, post-structuralist theologians who trying to make a very aesthetic, metaphorical way of God. They they all have something in common, regardless which time period, which culture, that God, and by extension, everything that is considered supernatural, paranormal, proto-natural, magic, regardless, right? All these things, supernatural, afterlife, all these things, they all have some level of agreement, and this agreement is these things. The one, it is not physical, and two, it doesn't bind the rules of space-time, so it is outside the physical spatial temporal world. This is the common way of description of a deity, regardless which culture, regardless which time period. Like I said, you could go back to the Paleolithic period, hunter-gatherer society like the San people, or today postmodern, post-structural theologians who still believe in some vague transcendence. And that is the common definition, at least consistently, of what is to be described as. That's the problem. That God is impossible. Because if it is not physical, there is nothing holding together to make it exist. If it's outside space, then there is nowhere where God will reside. God exists nowhere. If it is timeless, reside outside time, there is no time in which God exists in no time. So by pure definition of being that is outside of the physical spatial temporal world, God exists in nowhere, no time, and is made of nothing. God, it is impossible, categorically, metaphysically, ontologically, mathematically impossible. Even under postmodernism, which is by its foundation atheism, because they reject the concept of transcendence because it is the oldest of the meta-narratives. Like Lyotard in his book The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge, we no longer have God's point of view because the very concept of a transcendence, something outside the physical spatial temporal world, is no longer a credible view. It is a meta-narrative of the oldest kind, outdated, dead. That's why God is dead. We have moved beyond the concept of transcendence and by extension, metaphysics. And that is a very interesting observation when you look at it. Even, for some reason, you still believe in some type of a deity, even at the most vague sense, like I said, it's impossible. Or if you want to justify theism on the more rational grounds, maybe not traditional classical theism or polytheism or even deism, but you still want to justify like pantheism or panentheism or pandeism, stuff like that, where compared to other versions of theism, it is the more logical, a little makes a lot more sense, but like I said, it doesn't make sense at all. Well, the world as we know it, under all the evidence have point from past to now, that the world functions under the principles of what we call physicalism, that everything succeeds to the physical. And that is the main problem. The very concept of a deity and the supernatural and everything reside outside the physical spatio-temporal, which is inherently illogical. Even we look at positions like panentheism are distinguished from pantheists by their views about exactly what is that is divine. Panentheism, just like pantheism, say that natural reality is sus causal reality, but rather than say that natural reality is divine, panentheists say there are something further that is divine. Given the long history of those who've been labeled panentheists, mainly the Neoplatonists, like Plotinus, or the medieval Neoplatonists like Eckhart, the Christian mysticist, or modern Neoplatonists like the Schleiermacher or Hegel, or the American Transcendentalists, the first American natural world philosophy, right? Or process philosophy or process theology of Whitehead, and that's one of the many examples. It's unsurprising there are many different distinctions. There are said at least one who have been called self-identify as panentheists, but some panentheists suppose that the which is divine is greater than the physical spatio-temporal world and the natural causal reality. But including and interpreting it, some panentheists suppose that which is divine is a transcendent soul or spirit. Some panentheists suppose that which is divine is constituted from, but in some sense goes beyond the natural causal reality. Some panentheists suppose there is an internal relationship between the natural causal relationship and what is divine, which is divine influence, what natural causal reality is like, and natural causal reality affects, which is divine is like. Some panentheists are panpsychists, although that's not all panpsychists. You could be a physicalist and a panpsychist, although that's not a position most physicalists hold, although it's not incompatible per se. Committed to a neutral monism or strong emergence, like some panentheists claim that quantum entanglement provide a model for understanding the relationship between which is divine and the natural causal reality. The claims that are characteristic of panentheism are pretty clearly inconsistent with physicalism, that which it is divine includes and interprets natural causal reality. That which is divine is a non-natural causal entity, which is a non-natural causal power. This follows because inclusion and interpretation must be understood in causal terms. The causal powers of which includes and interprets natural causes, causal reality cannot be natural causal powers. If that which is divine is a transcendent soul or spirit, then that which is divine is a non-natural causal entity with non-natural causal powers. This follows because souls and spirit have causal powers, and the causal powers of the transcendent soul and spirit must be non-natural. If that which is divine is internally related to natural causal reality, and the way suggested above, then that which is divine is a natural causal entity, which is a non-natural causal power. This follows because the causal powers of that which interacts causally with natural causal reality cannot be natural if the causal powers. If that which is divine is strongly emergent from natural causal reality, then that which is divine has non-causal powers. This follows because the causal powers of that which is strongly emerged from the natural causal reality must be non-natural causal power. One of the most interesting recent defense of panentheism is provided by a man named Johnston in 2009. His defense is process panentheism, that he claims has no truck with the supernatural, i.e. with the invisible spiritual agency whose punitive intervention will violate the laws of nature. Even though the very foundations of panentheism, there is something outside of nature, fundamentally, while also interacting in nature. To Johnson, his process of pantheism encompassed legitimate naturalism, which again, if you understand what pantheism actually is, it contradicts it. The view that dominant the natural science complete on its own terms, every causal interaction ultimately consists in some other natural process, for example, mass energy transfers. However, according to Johnston, his process pantheism involves a rejection of scientism, a rejection of the view that only the natural realm exists. For in addition to the natural realm, there is also an autonomous realm of sense, the realm of virtue, of which things are intelligible. While repudiating pantheism, the view that the highest one is the natural realm, Johnson defends pantheism, the view that the highest one is wholly constituted with the natural realm. Moreover, he tells us that the meta definition, the highest one, is the outpouring of existence itself, always as a simplification in ordinary existence for the sake of self-discourse of existence itself. He also said the highest one is the true object of our innermost wills, the very thing he obscurely desire in everything we desire. We know the highest one, there could be no higher. We also know that the highest one could not have evil intent, not contempt for the truth. An immediate attentive response to all this is to assert that if the highest one can have intent, is as I implicate in the claim that we know that the highest one cannot have evil intent, and that the higher one has a causal power that is clearly not natural causal power. So on the account of naturalism, Johnson's process pantheism is not naturalistic. Suppose that it's literally true that the highest one loves and wills and intends and establishes natural law. Nonetheless, even if we suppose only that the highest one outpours and self-discloses and presents, it's still surely the case that the highest one is taken to have and to exercise non-causal the natural causal power, and that is enough to establish that on the account of physicalism and naturalism. Johnson's process pantheism is not naturalistic at all because it still relies on something outside of the physical spatial temporal world. He claims that religion is a complex and open-ended collection of cultic practices from which the practitioner derives a deeply capacity to deal with the manifest large-scale structural defects of human life. The religious life is a formal life in which we are reconciled to these large-scale defects of ordinary life. It provides a reservoir of energy otherwise dissipate in denial of and resistant to necessary suffering. He also adds that salvation is a new orientation that authentically addresses the large-scale defects of human life. It is orientation out of which one can live without denying or resisting the necessary suffering that is inherent on the large-scale defects of human life. It is transformed outlook which those defects are somehow overcome, healed or addressed or rendered irrelevant, redeemed but not removed, etc. True salvation consists of the right relation of the highest one. While Johnson is happy to allow that almost everything that is commonly called religion is not really a religion properly so called, it seems to me that he mistakenly something that is not even essentially religious for the whole of religion. On the account of religion, it is one important aspect of religion that provides mastery of people's existential anxieties, like what is the meaning of life, why am I here, what happens after I die. In Johnston's term, it provides adherence with the dependent capacity to deal with the manifest large-scale structural defects of human life, but it's not merely a religion that provides resource for dealing with people's existential anxieties. Despite what Johnston suggests, there are naturalistic acceptable alternatives whose efficiency is visible to the flourishing lives led by some naturalists and physicalists and materialists. While he favors religion resources involve life oriented toward the highest one, there is no good reason to suppose that this is the only way to achieve a genuine mastery of existential anxiety that he claimed to have. Some people say, okay, pantheism is not as rational because it resides something outside the universe, but pantheism surely has to be more rational, right? If you study Spinoza, right? Again, his philosophy is heavily complex, but regardless, the pantheism has to be a lot more rational, right? Because at least it's within the physical spatial temporal world, right? Or at least something to do with it. Well, there is a problem. Grandma Oppy has heavily noted the inconsistencies with that. They still function outside the physical spatial temporal world. In the mereological ontological argument, or as the name suggests, draws the research of mereology, the theory of the part-whole relation. An instance of argument this guys follow. 1. I exist. 2. Hence some, at least one thing exists. 3. Whatever something exists, there is a thing of which there are all parts. 4. Hence there is exactly one thing which everything is a part. 5. The unique thing which is everything is part is God. This is the definition, pantheism. Hence, God exists. The status of premise 1 is a controversial. Friends of two-dimensional model logic and others will be reluctant to grant the proposition that I exist in both contingent and knowledgeable a priori, even by me. Instead, they will insist that all that I know a priori is that the sentence I exist express some true proposition or other that I token it. But, of course, even that was sufficient for the purpose of the argument, provided that I know a priori that the sentence I exist express some true singular proposition or other, i.e. some proposition or other which contains an individual, then I have an a priori guarantee that some individual is some I am entitled to assert truth. Of course, it will remain true that there are some people who refuse to accept the second premise. Consider, for example, those ontological nihilists who take the proper logical form of every sentence can be given in a feature-placing language. However, many people will be prepared to grant what we can know a priori that there is at least some individual that is enough to sustain interest in our argument to this point. The status of premise 3 is also controversial. There are various reasons why one might be inclined to reject it. However, it is important to be clear about exactly what the premise says. Note in particular that it does not say that whenever something is said, there is something which is the mere logical sum of those things. Rather, it is said that is whatever some things exist, there are some things of which all those things are part, i.e. they identical completely overlap with each of the parts, but the parts together not completely overlap the thing. Of course, given the mereological claim about the sums, the weakest claim follows. Some friends of restricted mereological composition will certainly be happy with premise 3, but one who ascribe to 3 on independent grounds. One might think, for example, that it's just impossible there be the two things which are not both parts of a single, more inclusive thing. Again, there will be people who are not prepared to accept part 3, but for now it seems reasonable to suppose there will be lots of people who are quite happy with it. The inference of 4 from 3 looks distinctly suspicious. Indeed, it seems to have a form of quantified exchange fallacy, which moves from the universal existential to existential universal. However, we can patch this. What we need to suppose is that we can talk unrestrictedly about everything. Now consider all things. If premise 3 is correct, then it does indeed follow there is something which everything is a part. By part, I mean proper or improper part, of course. Moreover, it is then extremely plausible to suggest there can only be one such thing. In order to deny this, one can need to deny the uniqueness of composition, of course, which is impossible for at least pre-applied, quite unattractive. Of course, some people will not be happy with the claim that we talk unrestrictedly about everything. Among the reasons which might be given for the unhappiness, perhaps the most important is to suggest that unrestricted quantification leads to paradox. However, it is important to bear in mind that we are talking about quantification over individuals here, where one supposes there are finitely many, or countable many, or continuum many, unbathed to many, or even proper class many individuals. It is hard to see how any contradiction can arise from this assumption. Although, of course, there are other objectives which might make the total assumption. However, it again seems reasonable to suppose that there will be lots of people who are quite happy with it. Once more, we shall return to this assumption later. On the basis of the above consideration, it seems reasonable to suggest there will be lots of people, include lots of people who do not count themselves as having any kind of religious belief, who will be happy with the argument before. Or perhaps better, there will be lots of people, conclude lots of people do not count themselves as having any kinds of religious belief, who will be prepared to accept the following argument, at least for as far as 5. 1. I exist. 2. Some things, at least one exists. 3. If some things exist, that there are some things which all things are that exist. And 4. Wherever some things exist, there is something which they are all parts. This is from Methodology. 5. There is exactly one thing which is everything is a part. 6. The unique thing which everything is part is God, pantheism. Hence, God exists. In other words, there will be lots of people who are happy to allow on more or less a priori ground that there is exactly one thing which everything is part. So, for these people, She imports the question with whatever the thing of which everything is part deserves to be called, God. If this thing does deserve the name, then pantheism is vindicated. If it does not deserve the name, then presumably pantheism, or at least this kind of pantheism, is simply a mistake. Before we can decide whether the thing which everything is part deserves to be called God, we need to know more about the attribute of this thing. Even if our mereological ontological argument is successful, it doesn't give much information about the thing of which everything is a part, nor about its parts. Moreover, it's clear that opinion will differ widely according to prior metaphysical conviction. Consider the physicalists, those who suppose that there is exactly one physical universe which has none but physical parts. They will suppose that the thing in which everything is in part is the physical universe. Consider modal realists, those who suppose there are many possible worlds, those people who suppose that things in which everything is part of a mereological sum of the possible world. I assume, of course, that these modal realists suppose there are no individuals which are not overlapping completely by sum of possible worlds. Or consider the Platonists, those who suppose that among things which there are and there are non-spatial temporal individuals laid up in Plato's heaven. Those people who suppose that all these individuals number among the parts of things which everything is part. Which again, Pythagoras, was just a religious mystic, and Plato just took his ideas and philosophized it. So numerology and sacred geometry was actually a Plato's creation, not Pythagoras, as most people believe. So yeah, there's that. And so on. Some of these you can see to the better candidate with the name God than others. However, in order to make progress on this question, we need to think some more about what this a decent deserve of the name should be like. In some respect, the result is bound to be heterodox. However, we proceed, we are not going to arrive in a personal creator, but as it should be, pantheists of the kind of the considerable here typically do not suppose there is a personal creator. Moreover, there are ways of recording many other parts of religious orthodoxy. Consider the model realist view mentioned above. Everything can be done is done by some parts of a thing which everything is part, so there is a sense in which this being is omnipotent. Everything that can be known is known by some parts of the thing which everything is a part, so there is a sense which this being is omniscient. Every possible virtue is possessed by some part of the thing of which everything is part, so there is a sense in which this being is omnibenevolent, but not quite the traditional sense. Of course, after all, every possible vice is also possessed by some part of the thing which everything is part, so the same common sense this being is also omnibenevolent. Moreover, this is made true even at loss of imperial possible evil words are deemed to be impossible. Just for food of thought. Yeah. Everything is located in things of which everything is a part, so there is a sense in which this being is omnipresent, provided that one is prepared to allow temporal parts into one's ontology. One can also get a sense which is the thing of which everything is part is omnitemporal, and so on. Perhaps you could even make a case for the claim that the sum of possible world is a being that which no greater can be conceived after all. In this view, there is no greater being to have a conception of. Perhaps it is worth noting similar point can be made about the physicalist view. If everything is done by some part of the thing which everything is a part, so there is a sense of which there is a being is omnipotent. Everything is known by some part of the thing which everything is part, so there is a sense which this being is omniscient. Every virtue is possessed by some parts of the thing which everything is a part, so there is a sense which this being is omnibenevolent, but not quite the traditional sense. Everything is located in the thing which everything is part, so there is a sense which this being is omnipresence, and so on. But you can even make a claim that the physical is a being that which no greater can be conceived after all. In this view, there is no greater being of the conception of. These kinds of consideration about the attributes of the thing which everything is part do not speak the most important issue, which pantheists often overlook. Somehow or other, the appropriationists of the application of the name God to an object depended upon one, whether or not it is appropriate to take up a typical religious attitude towards that object, and perhaps also number two, whether or not that object could probably be seen as a focus of one of the well-known organized religions. Of course, it is easy to say what the typical religious attitudes are, but amongst them there surely be some kind of awe and also some kind of dependency and gratitude. Awe is easy. It is natural to think that our physicalists will be in awe in the physical thing which all other things are part. Such awe may not be mandatory, however, it should be widespread. Right, that's all we are talking about. Something on the order of the aesthetic response to spectacular landscape that it just seems wrong to say that there is anything of the religious significance here. In order to desert the appellation of religious, there must be more feeling of dependency and gratitude, or to respond to which the machinations of the organized relation can get a grip. But there is no reason to think that this response will be appropriate for that kind of things, which all other things are part mentioned previously. Indeed, it would just be a mistake to respond to the physical universe or the somewhat possible world with the response that are only appropriate directed towards a person. There are, of course, senses in which one might have feelings of dependence on, upon, and gratitude towards the thing which everything is a part. First, dependence. Clearly, your continuous existence depends upon its continuous existence. If it goes out of existence, then so do you. Second is gratitude. Given the first point, there is clearly some sense in which you should be grateful to the thing in which everything is the part that has not gone out of existence. Of course, the important point made is that they are not the religious response to which reference was made. Even though it is hard to articulate previously, there is clearly a good sense in which this kind of dependence and gratitude, which will be appropriate to have or they have not religious. No doubt the conclusion of this discussion was obvious from the beginning. Even we are as concise as we can about the claim that there is one thing in which everything is a part. Our meological ontological argument is bound to lack protective force. You can call my physicalist pantheism if you like. After all, the world can be yours to do with as you please, but wouldn't allow these people's religious belief in any ordinary sense of the word. Likewise, for our modern realists and Platonists, of course, it remains at least a tosestic possibility that the day in which everything is part is a being with religious significance, that all depends what thing of which everything's part turns out to be. But we are going to learn anything from this for our ontological argument, or any other similar argument. If our physicalists and modern realists and Platonists are wrong with the nature of thing, which everything is a part, then it could turn out that their belief about things ought to be religious. But as things stand, there is no reason to think that is in fact the case. The belief about the thing which everything is part ought to be religious in that sense. Objections to the previous section might be thoughtful as a minimal objection to our meological ontological argument. As we know, it is certainly possible to contest some of the metaphysical assumption which the argument requires. However, the argument can be firmly resisted even if all these assumptions are allowed to stand. Consequently, the sensible thing to do is to adopt the line of resistance, say cause of this little in terms of theoretical commitment. This approach is consistent with the general approach to ontological argument which I advocate. You can write in the Grammar Oppy book, Ontological Argument and Belief in God. He developed a taxonomy of 6 different kinds of ontological argument, and that suggests that each kind of ontological argument is vulnerable to the same kind of minimal criticism. This, the argument has one reading which they are invalid, and another reading of which they are question-begging. I require assumption which non-theists can reasonably reject, at least for all that the ontological arguments in question show. However, the identification of meological ontological argument, given only the previous treatments, given that this general criticism is not quite right, for in many cases ontological argument will also have a third reading on which they are neither question-begging nor invalid, but on which the entity whose existence they establish is a being of no religious significance. Consider, for example, the following argument. 1. I conceive of a being which is no greater can be conceived. 2. Has a being than which no greater can be conceived exists. 3. God exists. The question to ask about this argument is how the constructed expression of the form I conceive of X. Clearly there is a relation sense which the sentence of this form can only be true if X exists, and there is another non-relational sense in which the sentence of this form can be true whether or not X exists. If I conceive of X is meant to be constructed in a latter non-relational way, then an opponent of the above ontological argument should insist that the argument is invalid. On the other hand, if I conceive of X is meant to be constructed in the former relational way, that the opponent of the argument has a choice, either denying that X exists, which is tantamount to claiming that the argument in question begging, or accept that X exists, but deny that X is being which has any religious significance. Our modern realists who claim that the being that which no greater can be conceived is just the meological sum of all possible worlds, a being which is no sense good deserve of the name God. One way of restating the conclusion of our minimal criticism of the meological ontological argument is to not provide any interesting or informative mode of representation of the being whose existence they purport to establish. There are many metaphysical representatives from which one can accept the claim that there is a thing which everything is part, but many of these seem to have nothing at all to do with religious belief. A similar point can be made concerning a debate about the interpretation of St. Amso's Postmodern. Some people hold that the existence of God is established by the end of part 2, others hold that the existence of God is not established until the end of part 3, and yet others hold that the existence of God is not established until the end of the entire work, or at any rate the end of the part the 27, I think it was. However, all agree that the existence of being that which no greater can be conceived is established by the end of part 2, and they also all agree that the being that which no greater can be conceived is God. So the point of disagreement is just about whether a model presentation has been found which make clear the established whose existence has been established is God. Our discussion on pantheism suggests that there may be some point of this debate, but for the use of the same example, it might be that our model realists can agree there is a unique being that which no greater can be conceived, and if that is right, that there is a reason to think that the existence of God is not being established by the end of part 2. And of course, theists will agree that a being whose existence is established by the end of part 2 is God, but they should not think that the argument will persuade non-theists of the truth of the claim that the sentence God exists expressed a truth. Naturally, there's a reason why one might be skeptical about the claim which I have just made. One might doubt that the greater than should be cashed out in mereological terms. One might doubt that our model realists are really entitled to analyze conceivability in terms of possibility and so on. However, the point I want to make is just this. There will be some people who will apparently reasonably think that the argument of St. Anselm is sound, but the being those who existed established is not a being of any religious significance. It's also worth thinking a little more about the expression being that which no greater can be conceived. It is at least possible to take this expression to exhibit the same relational, non-relational ambiguity which discussed above in connection with the expression I conceive of X in one sense. The greatest being, if there is such a is the being than which no greater can be conceived. For our model realists and other plausible assumptions about the mereological nature of greatness, this being is just the sum of possible worlds. So on the relational reading, the being that which no greater can be conceived just as the sum of possible worlds, since some traditional theistic conceptions talk about the sum of all possibilities, it's not obvious that we should think that these considerations are generally irrelevant to traditional theistic argumentation. Many people will feel the minimal criticism of the mereological ontological argument for which I argue can be supplemented with much stronger criticism. In particular, will be many people who would think the premise free and for the revised version of the argument would not stand up to scrutiny, so perhaps it would be a good idea to close with a slightly closer look at this premise. Premise 3 say if some things exist, that there are some things which all things that exist, while one be disposed to reject this claim. Apart from the worry about the total entities mentioned in the introduction, the most likely suggestion is that the consideration for the ordinary language so that the quantification is always restricted quantification. There is no sense to be made of the suggestion that there can be unrestricted quantification. In my view, one only has to state this claim in order to see how implausible it is. Consider the claim that everything is self-identical. Surely the most natural way to understand the quantifier here is to think out to be unrestricted. Absolutely every single thing, without exception, is identical to itself. But when we quantify unrestrictedly, we quantify over absolute all things there are, and if we can quantify over all the things there are, then there are some things which there are all the things there are. Perhaps by counter-arguments, just question begging. Too bad. The claim that if there is some things, that there are some things which are all things that are strike as me as good indicate for the claim which is both analytic and a priori. It is often hard to find argument for primitive claims of this sort. I suppose that some people will hold that exist is ambiguous and has a different sense in different discourse. In this view, to say that chair and numbers exist will be strictly speaking nonsensical. Well, for while according to number discourse, it is analytic, there are number, and according to chair discourse, it is analytic, and there are chair, there are also discourse, which one can say there are both chairs and numbers, and hence which one can walk whether there are chairs or whether there are numbers. However, again, this kind of cannot be in position. I'm more inclined like a pragmatist with Quine. Exist is univocal. There is a single link which we all claims about existence can be assessed. Of course, I am not offering argument here, rather I identify one class of people who will not be disposed to accept premise 3. And like I said, Wilfred Seller, another pragmatist philosopher, the science is all they show you what it is and what it is not. And the Platonists associated with the outside physical spatial temporal world is nonsensical and had no linguistic meaning. As already hinted, I think that this view is extreme. However, I expect the only thing something equally extreme was sufficient for the rejected premise 3. Premise 4 at least per fiat much more problematic. Premise 4 say that whether something is it, there is something which there are all parts, but seem to be lots of views which this claim is mistaken. Suppose for the example that you think there is a non-spatial temporal individual. Suppose further that you are not a friend of restricted meteorological composition, that it might well seem natural to you to claim that there are lots of spare things which are not both parts of some inclusive things, and for example my heart and the number 2. Of course, you are a friend of restricted meteorological composition, that you get premise 4 for free. But others, it seems that the acceptability of premise 4 would depend upon prior metaphysical convention about what there is. Curiously, this kind of thought would typically motivate opposition the unrestricted meteorological composition, namely to desert the appellation. They must have some kind of inner unity, which unique because by mere meteorological composition is an institution which is shared by many theists and pantheists. One of the key religious institutions that there is, or indeed there must be, some kind of inner unity of two things. Consequently, there is some reason to think that premise 4 of our meteorological ontological argument cannot probably be motivated by appeal to unrestricted meteorological composition. The principle of unrestricted meteorological composition doesn't capture anything is possibly at odds with one of the principal institutions of many theists and pantheists. Even amongst those who prepare to accept the unrestricted meteorological composition, there may be some who are prepared to deny the standard meteorological assumption of uniqueness of composition. For instance, there are those who think there is a relation constitution which is not meteorological in nature. The statue and the lump of clay which the statues constitute are distinct, even though they have the same clay parts. However, this sample isn't enough to motivate rejection of uniqueness of composition. For this example, the relation of constitution is not symmetrical. The clay constituted by statue, and by the statue does not constitute the clay. Consequently, the statue has parts, i.e. the left hand part of the statue and the right hand part of the statue, which the clay does not. Remember that we are supposing the statue is distinct from the clay, which is constituted. In order to deny the uniqueness of composition on these kinds of ground, one needs to find a case where the relation of constitution is symmetrical, and then one could hold that there are two distinct entities who are exactly the same part. It is not easy to think of a possible example of this, however. In sum, then, we are various views which will lead one to reject the meteorological argument for the existence of things which all things are parts. I doubt there are arguments which will persuade people who hold this view to change their mind. However, there are also many people who will accept the argument for the existence of things which all things are part. Some of these people will be pantheists, but if they are, it will be more reasons which meteorological ontological argument does not make apparent. Again, we go back to the analysis of pantheism. They typically claim two things: natural reality is thus causal relation, and the natural reality is divine. Since naturalists accept A, the only thing questioned is whether nature also accepts B. On the account that I had given, the central question is whether being divine either is a non-natural causal power or else entails possession of non-causal powers. With the Mander, another philosopher, converses without himself endorsing a list of putative reasons for supposing that natural reality is divine. There's reason include that natural reality is unity, that natural reality is appropriated object of the pro-attitudes, that natural reality supports a grand narrative, that natural reality is or might be infinite, internal, and necessary, that natural reality is infallible, and the natural reality is personal, and the natural reality is axiological perfect. Among the putative reasons that Mander converses, there are several that can be happily embraced by naturalists who deny the natural reality is divine, the natural reality is a unity, and the natural reality is appropriate object of pro-attitudes. The natural reality support a grand narrative, and the natural realities or might be infinite, internal, and necessary. Of course, it is controversial whether natural reality is infinite, and it is controversial whether the natural reality is internal, and it is controversial whether natural reality is necessary. But even if natural reality possesses all three of these attributes, this provides no independent reason at all to suppose the natural reality is divine. Much of the same goes for other properties mentioned here. The natural reality is one that is supported a grand narrative, and that is the appropriate object of awe and wonder, provide no independent reason at all, support the natural reality is divine. And because, like I said, postmodernist, post-structuralist analysis, we reject the meta-narrative because it's like the end of history, but not the end of history that many liberals and conservatives like to use, but instead that we no longer are limited by the transcendence of the meta-narrative, the death of God, beyond the physical, spatial, temporal world. Among the punitive reasons the medical side, there are a couple that are really, non-starter. No natural can set the natural reality is infallible. That rules out the claim that scientific methods are touchstone for identifying the denizens of natural reality. Since that does inform us about natural reality, it's not true that natural reality is infallible. Moreover, no naturalist can accept that natural reality is astrologically perfect. It's the most straightforward common sense. There are many ways in which natural reality could be better than it is. When we eliminate the reason that carries out to the task, the only reason we are given for thinking that natural reality is divine is that natural reality is personal, at least in some kind of analogical sense. But even if it is consistent with naturalists to suppose that natural reality is personal, at least in some kind of analogical sense, we then need to ask whether the attributes of personality entail the attributes of non-natural causal powers. It seems to me that it does, even if we suppose that personality is to be understood in an analogical sense. It seems to me that being a person entails having a certain kind of causal powers, such as those involved in thinking, feeling, sensing, and so on. Where these two are understood in the same kind of analogical sense, clearly there is nothing inside to tell us that natural reality had these powers. So the proper conclusion to draw is that there are non-natural causal powers. Not all pantheists support the divine is personal, but those pantheists who support that the divine is personal face the task of explaining how they understood their claim that natural reality is divine. We follow the lead provided by Mander. It's hard not to reach the conclusion that pantheists who support the divine is not personal are unable to discharge this debt, and for the reason just given, those pantheists who do not support that the divine is personal are not naturalists on the account of physicalism. Elsewhere, I suggest a minimal characteristic of, the wise physicalism, which is within nothing exists beyond the physical, spatial, temporal realm, and the only mind the entities are involved, creatures with relatively complex biological structure, and based on functionalist and computational theory of the mind or computationalism, you just need a physical structure, right? Because everything has information, background knowledge, everything has information, data, and everything they use is semi-digital to begin with. So my upload is actually a thing. And claim that nothing is divine or sacred is worthy of worship. In the present world, I suggest that we should define, these things as illogical and impossible, given they still assume something that is in nature nonsensical, transcendent. They may say that natural reality is Saul's causal relationship, but that's still the case that pantheists are not naturalists. Therefore, the claim that natural reality is divine contradicts the claim that natural reality is Saul's causal relationships. And last but not least, for people trying to use a mathematical argument for there is a deity out there, regardless which version we talk about, it still doesn't make sense. In fact, even recently, AI, yes, you heard me right, AI disproved Godel's ontological argument for God. Yes, there is AI doing metaphysics, although as a postmodern and pragmatist, I reject metaphysics altogether. So even I use the same conclusion as the metaphysical naturalist, we're still using, the ontology and other stuff. So yeah, again, I will put a collection of literature there in the description. This is not considered secondary literature, the Godel's ontological argument, and in particular interest is consoled by, attention to the object of this argument, which is here though gone unnoted. This objection does not depend upon the fine details of the formulation of the arguments, because let's be honest, it will take all day. Arbitrary chose to by objection in connection with the formulation provided by Anderson, who made, extended the argument in 1990. A brief summary I should consider may summarize thus. Definition 1. X is godlike if X has essential property those and only those properties which are positive. Definition 2. If A is an essence of X, if for every property of B, X has B necessary if A entails B. Definition 3. X necessarily exists if every instance of X is necessarily exemplified. Axiom 1. If a property is positive, then its negation is not positive. Axiom 2. Any property entailed by strictly implied by a positive property is positive. Axiom 3. The property of being godlike is positive. Axiom 4. If a property is positive, then it is necessarily positive. Axiom 5. Necessary existence is positive. Theorem 1. If a property is positive, there is a consistent, equal, possible, and simplified. Corollary 1. The property of being godlike is consistent. Theorem 2. If something is godlike, then the property of being godlike is the essence of that thing. Theorem 3. The property of being godlike is exemplified. Given a sufficient generous conception of properties and granted of the acceptability of the underlying modal logic, the three are listed to the following from the axiom. So said Godel, Daniel Scott, Sobel, Anderson, and Adams. Perhaps one may object to the conception of properties and or modal logic, but one doesn't need to. The proof is demonstrating no good even these things are accepted. The problem is with virtually all ontological arguments, to me, lies in the fact there are parallel arguments which can be constructed, which seems no less acceptable to the atheism and agnostics who accept these to observe results. A template for constructing the parallel argument is as follows. Definition 1. 1. X is God, like if X is an essential property, those and only those properties which are positively assert for P1, Pn. Definition 2. If A is an essence of X, if for every property B, X has B necessarily if A entails B. Definition 3. X necessarily exists if every essence of X is necessarily exemplified. Axiom 1. If property is positive, there is negation is not positive. Axiom 2. If any property entailed by strictly implied by a positive property is positive. Axiom 3. The property of being godlike is positive. Axiom 4. If property is positive, there is necessary positive. Axiom 5. The necessary existence is positive and distinct from each of P1 of Pn. Theorem 1. If property is positive, there is a consistent equal possibility exemplified. Corollary 1. The property of being godlike is consistent. Theorem 2. If something is godlike, then the property of being godlike is the essence of that thing. Theorem 3. Necessary. The property of being godlike is exemplified. So, for each collection of positive properties which include necessary existence, there is a being which has exactly those positive properties, and which are no other positive properties. If there is only n plus 1 positive property, this gives us a true and distinct necessary existent beings, not good. Perhaps n is a finite. If so, there are even worse. In order to rule out the parallel argument, one might take the view that any collection of positive property which includes necessary existence entails that each of the other positive property, i.e. that any that has some of the positive property include necessary existence, must have them all. This is a very strong assumption if required that each of the positive property entailed by necessary existence alone. Hence, rules out the existence of any necessary beings other than one with all the positive properties. Those who are inclined to think that numbers and all other abstract are necessary existence will not find this acceptable, and in any case there is still a problem of implementation. Suppose that we add the following axiom to our original collection. Axiom 6. Nothing that has some positive property include necessary existence fails to be godlike. This seems to be there is a different type of disturbing parallel argument which can be generated. Let be some proper subset of the positive property which incline necessary existence. Say there is a property is positive, just in case it belongs to a collection. Then our template for constructing parallel argument is as follows. Definition 1. X is God, like if X was an essential property, those and only those properties which are positive. Definition 2. A is an essence of X if for every property B, X has B necessary if A entails B. Definition 3. If necessary exists, if every essence of X is necessary and simplified. Axiom 1. If a property is positive, there is negation is not positive. Axiom 2. Any property entailed by, strictly implied by a positive property is positive. Axiom 3. The property of being godlike is positive. Axiom 4. If property is positive, there is a necessary positive. Axiom 5. Necessary existence is positive. Axiom 6. Nothing can have some positive property could necessary existence fail to be godlike. Theorem 1. If property is positive, there is consistent, possibly simplified. Corollary 1. The property of being godlike is consistent. they are true. If something is godlike, then the property of being godlike is the essence of that thing. They are free. Necessary property of being godlike is exemplified. Of course, the defenders of the original argument will object that axiom 6 is false. Nothing which is godlike is God. Like, even though anything which is godlike has some positive property, including necessary existence, but I can't see any reason why opponents of the original argument should be disposed to see any merit of this objection. For it relies on the assumption that there is something which is godlike, i.e., relies on the conclusion which the original argument was supposed to demonstrate. If there is nothing which is godlike, then at least for all that was being said so far, it might be there is something which is God, like, i.e., it might be the axiom is true, which axiom 6 is false. So it seems that atheist opponents of the argument can see that there are two end arguments for incompatible beings, none of which provide any more reason to accept the other conclusion than the other. In these circumstances, it is reasonable for atheists to reject all arguments, so the original ontological argument fails. At this point, I am inclined to try the conclusion that the defenders of the original argument is playing a loosey hand. Perhaps I am wrong about this, but I do not think I will be alone thinking there are no prospect for the production of the Godelian ontological argument, which does not admit to these kinds of demanding parallel. But even though in recent years AI has disproven it, so yeah, there's that. So it's not even justifiable for position anymore. So suppose that my conjecture is correct. They seem to me that we conclude there is more wrong to the original Godelian ontological argument than anyone has here suggests. One might, worry whether a godlike being will have attributes that traditionally ascribed to God, Adams, or perhaps one might insist that describe the godlike being could have an attribute traditionally ascribed to God. Or, but if I'm right, this sort of consideration might be very unimportant. The possibility of producing the kind of parallel which I offer show that at least the reasonable atheists had good reason not to persuade the Godelian ontological argument, even before even those comparative unimportant considerations are introduced. Of course, there are still questions pinpointing the errors of the Godelian argument. The production of damaging parallels may show that there is something wrong and does not constructively identify the errors. I guess reasonable atheists are bound to say that one of the axioms is likely false. One's obvious candidate is axiom 5. Granted the rest of the theoretical machinery, reasonable atheists may perhaps should say that necessary existence is positive only if it is simplified. If this is denied, it is granted that necessary existence is positive whether or not it is simplified. There are another obvious candidate, axiom 3. Granted for the rest of the theoretical machinery, which include axiom 5, atheists may perhaps should say that the property of the being godlike is positive only if it is simplified. Either way, it would then be clear why the argument failed to see one will only think that the proof constitutes a sound argument if one is anticipated convinced of the truth of its conclusion. Moreover, though I shall try to argue the claim here to me argument does not constitute a proof, or to persuade atheists of the truth of the conclusion, they concede that the argument is utterly worthless. It has all the only virtues of this classical argument, either 2 plus 2 equals 5 or God exists. It's not the case that 2 plus 2 equals 5 therefore God exists. An argument which all theists should think is sound, at least granted the stipulation that logical connectors are all to be interpreted classically, but which has no virtue whatsoever. Last but not least, a great article written by the intellectual Dana, yeah, that's his name, a critique of pantheism, which is a combination of pantheism and deism, like the founding fathers and the intellectual movement, stuff like that. From the book Pantheism and Theology, and it is a critique implied equally to creationism because they use basically the same presentation. The pantheist possesses a creator deity that becomes the universe itself upon its creation. As such, it had the most elemental creationist theology, sidestepping anti-evolution, intelligent design, and other post-creation arguments favoring religion. In debunking pantheism by means of recent findings in cosmology and astrophysics, this reader-friendly article for the intellectual curious non-scientist also effectively debunks all forms of scientific creationism. In doing so, it could visibly expose the falseness of supernaturalism, regardless of which religion is the partner in delusion. A complete definition of pantheism may be found elsewhere in this Anthology, which is the book I'm referring. For the purpose of this critique, I will use the definition that belief that a creator deity became the universe and ceased to exist as a separate and conscious entity. As such, pantheism is a presuppositional theory attempting to explain the beginning of the universe, the presupposition being the existence had a beginning at all. Here, existence is differentiated from the universe, and the Big Bang is differentiated from the beginning of existence, as will be discussed. My view that pantheism is an errorist theory rested on three contentions which I will elaborate. There is no evidence that a creator deity ever existed. Pantheism is not compatible with science, which they claim to be, and pantheism, like ordinary theism, arises in part from the human inability to fathom the dimension of infinite time and infinite space. Virtually every human culture in history has invented religion, deities, afterlife myths, and creation myths to explain the mystery they encounter in their time. However, biologists, the E.W. Wilson, estimate that over the past 60,000 years, humans have devised roughly 100,000 religions based on roughly 2,500 gods. The great majority of these religions are now extinct, having no contemporary adherents. The origins of the ancient Greek is now taught in educational institutions as Greek mythology. It's the extinct religion perhaps best known to our readers. Pantheism differs from today's popular religion in that deity is no longer believed to exist in a conscious or active form. Hence, it is not a personal God with whom the faithful may communicate via prayer or other channel. Pantheism that does, however, hold that a conscious deity once exists that imbued the universe with intelligent and other sentient qualities, which I again mentioned earlier. The very concept of something outside physical, spatial, temporal world is impossible. But regardless, a problem with that pantheism shared with other religions is that there is no empirical evidence that be found by scientific means that any deity has ever existed. The major is that religion rely on purposely divinely inspired holy books as a proof of the truth of their beliefs, which is fallacious circular reasoning. I recall a cartoon photo of the paper tab napkin with a handwritten inscription. The napkin religion is the one true religion because it says so here on the napkin. Listing over 15 religions that are sacred texts may be found on Wikipedia. On religious texts, of course, not all religious texts can be chosen, as many other doctrines are mutually incompatible. For example, some are monotheists, and the others are polytheists, and not all other holy books could possibly have been divinely created, since differently and often disagreed gods are believed to have inspired them. Clearly, at most, only one of these religions can possibly be entirely true. Further, if all but one are not true, as logic dictates, it is likely that none are true. After all, how confident can a believer be that one religion be out of the many thousands happen to be the one religion, consider the fact that no religion is supported by any empirical evidence whatsoever? Therefore, by all the most fundamental believers recognize the infallibility of the so-called sacred texts as evidence of the factuality of their belief. Of course, pantheism has no divinely inspired sacred text, and so its inherent faith in the creator deity is based on the other premise. Their worldview depends on a priori principle of pure intuitive reason to derive their belief that as a creator deity once existed, and that the deity became the universe itself. The history of the philosophy is littered with the carcasses of belief derived from pure reason. The most famous is the certain element of Kantism itself, the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who originated the term pure reason in 1781, 6 years before pantheism was first mentioned by one of Kant's own countrymen. For example, Kant believed in God only to the extent that reason that morally deductive requires a belief in God. Secular humanists vigorously assert that without overwhelmingly supported evidence that morality and social ethics are untethered to religious belief and they are regularly practiced by non-believers, hence the common humanist refrain, good without God. I will leave to other contributors to this ontology to ask to elaborate the a priori principle assumption for the which belief is pantheism's creator deity is derived. Those assumptions will be apparent in their argument for the existence of their God or deity. Being familiar with the Christian apologetics, I recognize that the language of science is used disingenuously to suppose the tenets of their faith, as shown in theological argument from intelligent design and other pre-propositional attempts to logically prove the faculty of Christian theology and Islamic theology, and recently in the internet Hindu theology. In my view, pantheism falls with the victim to or as a result of similar flawed logic. I'm sure my contributor will fervently rejoin with the opposing view that has asserted. To better understand pantheism, in preparation for this writing, I posed 3 questions to Kiono Mapso, the editor of the Ontology. Here's my first question and his answer. Question 1. Who/what created the creator, or did the creator not exist in time and space prior to creation? His answer. A capitalization or refrain. If a creator is to be posited, it indeed follows that this creator must have either himself come into existence, though some spontaneous process did not require a creator, or was itself intentionally created by your creator, or simply entirely without origin. Our estimate editor acknowledged that his answer is speculative, as no evidence is available to support any of the 3 alternatives he offered. Indeed, no empirical evidence is even conceivable that would assist us in selecting one of the 3 possibilities he provides. Rather, those alternative solutions are derived from the a priori assumption that the creator deity existed. If the further to my empirical audience showed me the evidence, mine, none of the 3 alternatives won't be possible. Therefore, the question of what precedes the existence of the creator remains unanswered, and as I believe the unanswerable is if a scientific and possible response is required. That is, the a priori principle of the existence of a creator deity is unsupported by the evidence or by logic, and is therefore a false assumption. Some readers may remind the antidote reported by cosmologist Stephen Hawking in his 1988 book A Brief History of Time. So it seems that pantheism share a common conductor with theistic religion. Where they can come from, if we are to avoid the tortured circular reasoning of Christian apologetics, we require at least my modicum of plausibility. Given that other absent any supporting empirical evidence, it's hard to escape the reasonable conclusion that God or some other created deity by the name does not and did not ever exist. Mr. Mapso Baudrillard his nature by pointing out that time is non-linear, and that time may have also begun at the moment of creation of matter. Time is indeed a variable dimension of space affected by gravity, as confirmed by empirical texts of Einstein's theory of relativity. So its inconsistency may be wrongly considered by proponents of pantheism to be supportive of the notion that creator deity created itself at the moment of creation of matter and energy. Indeed, matter and energy are interchangeable quantities according to formula E equals mc squared, where the speed of light is constant. Cosmologists and particle physicists such as Louis Krauss describe the Big Bang as pure energy, with matter in the form of subatommic particles coming into existence within a minuscule fraction of a second thereafter. Further, Krauss states that time itself came into existence at the moment as well, insofar time is functional motion of particles in the primordial universe. Scientists who support the notion of a multiverse, such as actual physicist Carl Hallier, argue that our universe may be only one of many, and more likely an infinite number separated by hyperdistance, scattered throughout infinite space. See the semantic discussion of space versus existence and other articles, entirely out of contact with each other. Immediately, the concept of multiverse is speculative, but recently there's evidence of a multiverse. So yeah, the main problem which version of the multiverse theory is correct. Probably can never be confirmed empirically, although Haller's philosophical argument is compelling. Moreover, the dimension of infinite time and space are beyond our limited human powers of imagination. It's instructive to know, however, that Krauss, Hawking, Tyson, Weinberg, Green, Reinter, Hader, and all the great majority of the proponent cosmologists are self-identified atheists, who do not find it necessary to possess a creator deity to account for the beginning of our universe. So it may be a bit of a presumption of laymen relative to the field of cosmology and astrophysics to insist otherwise. Indeed, a survey of members of the National Academy of Science found that 93% are atheists. Or is that the most accomplished scientists regard the notion of deity to not useful in their disciplinary search for understanding the natural world and its origin? Again, there's the second question. But what physical mechanism did the creator manufacture the material universe? Or did the creator not exist prior to the creation / Big Bang, in which time particle exists as we know, which began to take form? His answer: we don't know, but the answer will be discovered by science. But it does seem something had to exist, or there has no reason for there ever to be change in the status quo of nothing existing. As cosmologist Lawrence Krauss discussed in his book A Universe from Nothing, the laws of physics as they operate in our universe appear concurrently with the Big Bang, not before it. The laws are known as the Standard Model, which identify the electromagnetism, the weak and strong nuclear forces, and classification of all known subatomic particles. Indeed, in conjecture multiverse, other universe may contain matter of the form and nature which may be quite different from matter energy as they appear in our local universe, and may appear under different physical processes that those observed in our universe. Normal, i.e., observable matter, comprises only about 5% of the mass of our universe. The remainder be dark matter and dark energy. These substances, perhaps not suitable terms since little is known about their physical property, interact with gravity, but not with light. That is, dark matter cannot be visually detected with telescopes, but it does produce observable effects on the motion of stars, galaxies, and other massive objects. It is plausible, albeit highly speculative, that dark matter and dark energy are associated with separate universes that originate in a separate Big Bang that is correlated with ours in space, and is operate under different laws that the Standard Model describe normal matter and energy. Or, if science develops instruments capable of empirically observing dark matter and dark energy, which is invisible to our existing technology, the Standard Model may be revised to include additional particle forces that may define these phenomena as derived from our Big Bang and therefore as part of our universe. In any case, dark matter dark energy does not conform to the current Standard Model, so speculate another Big Bang that create a different universe might operate under different physical laws which will have come into existence at that universe moment of creation. The physical nature of dark matter dark energy constitutes one of the great mysteries that cosmology and physicists are currently studying. So we see that a system may not be limited to our local universe, which indeed began with the Big Bang. Other universes quite likely exist, as Hägglund argued. Consequently, the beginning of existence, which pantheism attempts to explain by posing a creator deity, is an irrelevant concept, and one accepts that time as well as space are infinite in dimension and may contain an infinite number of universes. Perhaps distance of some other term will be more suitable than space in this context, as Krauss argues space itself was created with the Big Bang and will continue to expand internally. He explained that since space, even where devoid of matter radiation, contains quantum mechanical processes and dark energy, it is not nothing. So hyperdistant regions between universes are not the same empirically observed empty space that exists within our universe. Envisioning nothing, not even so-called distinct, challenge our frail human imagination, as does the infinite dimension of space-time. Nevertheless, if the multiverse exists as a probable, then absolute nothingness between universes probably also exists. To the extent that we are capable of imagining this nothingness, and we can imagine the Big Bang created the matter, energy, time, and space that constitute our universe. Existence, all that exists, then composes all universes plus whatever lies between them, which is not to be confused with empty space, as appears within our particular universe. Further, it may not be physically possible for anything such as light to penetrate or travel through that inter-universe medium, ensuring that each universe remain isolated from all others. Science also shows speculation as long as supernaturalism is not introduced. After all, science is the study of nature. Pantheism, a theology that presupposes a non-material supernatural creator deity, is demonstrably unscientific theory of existence. A review of various multiverse theories may assist readers in only the incomprehensible scale of infinite space-time and fathomless nothingness, not even the something of empty space between universes. Note that these are science-based speculation, not theological rendering of mysterious existence, since science does not anticipate ever being capable of direct empirical observation of other universes. Multiverse theory will not doubtly make speculation. Further advances in science, however, will surely refine those speculations. My conclusion is that all but very few professional cosmologists in the condition present at the moment of the Big Bang, which has existed through the infinite time and infinite space, possibly contain an infinite number of universes, were quite capable of creating our home universe 13.72 billion years ago, without midwifery of a god. As mind-stretching as the concept of infinite space-time may be, it is nevertheless more plausible and more consistent with known science that is a creator deity. Gods are best understood as man-made events arising from our pre-science ancestors and attempts over millennia to explain otherwise inescapable mysteries of their earthbound environment. Otherwise, we face even more daunting task to explain without resorting to mysticism that happened before the beginning of time. What lies beyond the edge of space? Which of these two universe views, dear reader, is your conclusion? Empiricism or mysticism? Reason or mythology? I see no third option. I see no hybrid. And my final question to Mapso is, is/was the creator supernatural, or were the principles of the particle physics the natural world at work within the entity of the creator, or it was the creator a non-material being prior to creation of the universe? If the latter, what is the sense that the creator exists prior to creation? His answer: if it exists, it is bound to the same laws of the mathematics and logic, at least though not necessarily all the laws which govern our universe. There are aspects of our universe, the specific speed of light, ratio, and certain particle size, which scientists have debated could be different alternate universes. So the question really is, what characteristic must persist in any universe, and they will find what governs any creator. Physicists and other working in the natural science consider anything that exists whether or not it is yet discovered to exist in the natural world, which is comprised of physical matter, including subatomic particles, so far as identifying the standard model. There is nothing exist that has no physical properties. For example, humans do not have a soul apart from a biological process occurring within the physical body. Similarly, consciousness is nothing more than a subject experience of biological process within a living brain. When the brain ceases to function, that's when the body the house it dies, consciousness ceases. So consequently, there is no conscious afterlife and no soul to survive for physical death. To be sure, a biogenetic origin of life is the vital, fully understood process and the subject at the research. There is no scientific basis for thinking that life or consciousness is a supernatural phenomenon that functions outside the laws of science. And even if there is an afterlife, it has to function under physicalism and naturalism, which you can make a good case for a naturalist afterlife, but most people don't hold that position. It's either afterlife and supernatural, or naturalism and no afterlife. Like, there's often no in between. My third question to myself of whether as pantheism hold that the creator deity was an entity composed of physical matter, or alternatively to pantheists believe that the creator was a supernatural having no physical properties. If the affirmation that the deity is part of the natural universe and therefore must be compromised of the physical property consists with the standard model, and so is subject to research by the scientific method. If the latter, we must utterly reject the notion of a supernatural deity, since involving standard model describes and defines all that is natural. The supposed creator deity is believed by adherents of pantheism to have possessed consciousness and intelligence, absent physical, but doesn't have physical properties such as attributes are scientifically impossible. I shall close this critique by a brief rebuttal of three additional notions advanced by proponents of pantheism supporting their creationist worldview: fortitude and the fine-tuned universe. Apologists for pantheism and for creationism more broadly argue that certain improbable fortitudes constitute compelling evidence for the existence of a creator deity. Several examples are proffered of fine-tuning the laws of physics of the cosmological condition that, if significantly different from their existing value, will render the universe structurally dysfunctional and make carbon-based life impossible. These conditions include the ratio of the strength of the electromagnetism to strength of gravity, and the ratio of dark energy to the density of the universe. The actual physicists Martin Reed cite these as improbable that conscious and intelligent creator might have been designed to allow life to appear. Interestingly, the professor in question has more recently stated, "I got no religious belief at all." Although some scientists such as Reed support the fine-tuning hypothesis, it does not argue instead the universe is not fine-tuned to us, rather we are fine-tuned to the universe. That is, humans and all other life forms exist only in the condition in which it is possible for us to exist. If our universe were fate to unaccommodated to life, then life would not exist here. We happen to reside where life is possible. Hence, we are here to ask the question: there is no support for the cosmic mandate that life must exist in our universe or in others. Cosmologist Victor Stirner, author of The Fallacy of Fine-Tuning, Why the Universe is Not Designed to Us, explains how the strong anthropic principle distorts the perception by causing humans absurd to assume the universe exists for special benefit of humans, when in fact the universe is simply the way it is. We humans happen to be compatible with the minuscule niche of space-time in which we find ourselves, where we suited to evolve to currently exist and to observe ourselves and reflect upon our own existence. This is quite a simple notion actually. Once we cease insisting that we are the cosmic center of the stage. Why does the universe exist? Pantheists attempt to answer the question by posing a conscious creator who had his desire of intention to create the universe. It is human nature to wonder why. Why did you say that? Why did that accident happen to me? Why was born? Asking why is the wrong question in scientific inquiry, except in some social psychological research. Why presupposes an intention, which in turn presupposes a conscious entity, and that is the purpose of its action. Lewis Krauss explained in A Universe from Nothing that more useful question is, how did the universe come into existence? How it will end? cosmologists had yet to achieve consensus about how the universe will end. A big crunch in which the universe collapsed under the force of gravity into singularity, a zero-dimensional point of infinite density, was the lead contending theory until dark energy was discovered in the 90s. Dark energy and apparently repulsive gravitational force account for the increased rate of acceleration of expansion of the universe. Internal expansion is now considered the most likely. Time as a mathematical measure of dimension, by in the end in the pre-crush were to be our universe's fate, said presumably there will be no longer be matter in motion, although current physics is inadequate to explain what happened at the near of singularity. But infinite space-time will remain possibly containing other universes under other outcome. Theology in general, and pantheism in particular, contribute nothing to our understanding of this question, nor to its answers. So scientifically appropriate to answer why does the universe exist is there is no answer, there is no purpose, no conscious creator deity have intention to lead the creation of the universe. Pantheism claimed that the creator existed prior to the creation of the physical property of the material universe, at least appear concurrent with it. Supernaturalism is the mystical belief that entities exist beyond the empirical observable reality, outside the laws of nature, especially the standard model of particle physics. Prior to the advent of modern science, generally ascribed to the works of Galileo in the 17th century, humans had few observation and analytical tools for determining what is real. The ancient Greek may attempt to empirically understand reality by proposing earth, water, fire as the first elements of the natural world. Microscope, telescope, spectroscopes, and the Large Hadron Collider, and multiple other data gathering tools has been developed that greatly increase our ability to see the nature beyond the human scale. Two obstacles implement the popular conceptions, the exceptions of scientism that is more iterative approach to a question of knowledge. 1. Is sufficient science education among the global population, and 2. The psychological property of human to invent religion and other forms of mysticism. I recognize that scientism is controversial, criticized by some excessive dependence of science on the scientific method. To be sure, personally meaningful insight can do occur through music, art, and other non-scientific endeavors, and the impact of such endeavor on subject human experience can be and are studied scientifically. But if one's goal is to understand objective reality apart from human subjectivity, science represents the only valid approach to achieve it. Religious believers who regard fate alone without empirical evidence is sufficient to believe in their particular creation story, gods, afterlife, myths, spirits, and other supernatural beings, conveniently ignore many set of scientific facts and by logical necessity refute scientism. I have long been baffled that reason and questionable faith can inhabit an intelligent, educated mind, but has an unrecognized sleight of mind bridge the dissidence. Daniel Ray examines in The God Virus how religion affects our lives and culture, how mystical belief propagate within a host culture and impair rational thought by means that are currently analogous to viral infection in living organisms. As with, biological virus, the God virus can infect intelligence. Well-educated people, as it does, who of aspire at the 50th percentile, do not as markedly. Pantheism in position of creativity in the form of supernatural without notwithstanding pantheists believe that the creator became a natural world once the actual creation occurred. It followed that the now defunct deity is not described, but the physics and describe the universe we find today as pantheists appear to acknowledge the belief is incompatible with science. My proposed this article is to encourage science-based critical thinking among adherents to pantheism and of religion in general. I recognize science and religion as inherently incompatible because they put forth mutually inconsistent theories of existence. I anticipate the first scientific discovery advance our knowledge of the natural world. Religion will succeed in harmful presence of human affairs. I readily admit, however, that pantheism is perhaps the least harmful religion yet invented. So yeah, God is impossible, and God is dead.